Hello and welcome to my Korean colleagues. My name is Anders and I will give you a brief introduction and a contextualization of the research results that we will give to you in the later lectures. Of course, this will have to be brief, and I have added my email address to this title page, so if you have any questions or anything that you would like to learn more about, or maybe ask some questions, you are of course free to contact me. The history of education in Norway is a long one, but the compulsory public schooling system started in the late 19th century, and it was quite different in urban and rural areas. And this points to a very strong social and political divide within Norwegian system that goes back for centuries. What students learned in urban schools in the larger cities was different from what they learned in the rural areas. And this has to do with the industrialized society in the major cities and the rural agricultural life of the rural areas. What was common for them was that they both focused on specific values that were national values in the 19th and early 20th century. The role of the schooling system was to make the students into Norwegians. They were to learn about what it was to be a Norwegian citizen. So they learned about Norwegian history, Norwegian culture, Norwegian language to make them into Norwegian citizens. And we can say it's a major divide. About 1945, and especially in the post-war era, when the civic education in Norwegian school has moved towards other values. They're still value-focused, but these values are more democratic than national. And then the students are supposed to learn what it means to be a citizen in Norway, not a Norwegian citizen necessarily, more exclusively. And one thing that is important to know about Norwegian history and civic education is that very much of Norwegian history has been dominated by a struggle for independence, both politically, culturally, and economically, from our stronger neighbors, Denmark and Sweden. Historically, both Norway and Finland have been dominated by the stronger powers, Denmark and Sweden. And from the 18th century, you could say that the movement towards more independence for Norway, more self-government, has also meant more democracy. Because as we have moved towards greater independence, especially with the introduction of the Norwegian Constitution in 1814, when we became partially independent from Denmark, then we also moved from a system where the king was the sole ruler into a constitutional monarchy where an elective parliament had strong power as well as the king. And also the full independence of Norway from Sweden in 1905 was also a movement towards more democratic rule and more people in the population being included in the ruling of the state. So we have a parallel process of democratization and national self-government in Norwegian history. And that is important in order to understand how strongly we value civic education, learning about democratic participation, also in educational system of today. So wanted to point very briefly towards the development of the Scandinavian public school system in the post-war era. This is common for the entire Scandinavian region. Norway is part of that. This was closely tied to the expansion of the welfare state, and the basic idea was that to reduce class tensions, it was better to integrate the working class into the national whole. So the idea was that through the promotion of education for everyone, everybody should have the possibility to succeed and to develop and to move on into higher education. That was usually only for the social and cultural elites. And from the 1960s onwards, we see a massive expansion of higher education also in the Scandinavian countries, including Norway, where it was much easier to go to university. So many people also from a poorer background could move into university and have a university education. And this is, of course, a very social leveling instrument. So these educational reforms were part of the modernization of Norway after the Second World War and a massive industrialization, the building of new industry. So students were encouraged to take part in democracy, but then mostly focused on elective democracy, taking part in elections. So this expansion, you could say, was also an expansion of civic education. In the 1970s, we see a movement towards a more critical approach to this modernization drive. And we see the introduction of critical pedagogy in all the Nordic or Scandinavian countries in the 1970s, and then also in Norway. And it was critical in the sense that it asked more critical questions towards, for instance, industrialization, and not only to promote the building of new industry, but also to ask what are the consequences for the environment, for instance. So from the 1970s, we see a quite small, but at least a beginning of an environmental issues taking a role in the Norwegian education. And we also see that within civic education, there is a shift, gradual shift, from being focused towards more individual rights rather than the duties you have towards the collective. So we see this didn't happen overnight, but there's a gradual shift from the 1970s. This decade also introduced more focus on women's rights and gender roles, and also indigenous peoples. And in a Norwegian context, this was then the Sami population, usually lives in the northern parts of Norway. That is the official indigenous population in Norway. They got a much more central role within Norwegian education and also civic education beginning from the 1970s. So moving quickly along to our own period and decades, the current Norwegian Education Act and national curricula, which is from 2020. It states very clearly that it is an essential task of education to promote democracy and democratic participation. And also that the students in Norwegian school system should experience democratic interaction in their everyday life. So in their everyday life experiences in school, they should be part of forming how the school day is for them. They should have some say in their own education. So school is not some place you go to learn about things or to be educated, like a passive recipient of knowledge. You should also be an active participant, and you should have some influence on how your education is actually carried out. This is not so easy to do in practice because schools tend to be quite hierarchical, but the idea is to be more on the same level, the teacher and the student. But still, continuing from the earliest period, there is a strong focus on rights and promotion of specific values. And today they are very closely tied to human rights, focusing on equality, sustainability, anti-racism, tolerance, and also then these various levels of participation. Very, very briefly about current Norwegian civic education. Its aims are, as I said, strongly expressed in the national curricula, and it's supposed to be cross-curricular. This is something that every school subject should work on, promote democratic values, but it's particularly and specifically in the school subject social studies. It has a more specific role in promotion of democratic participation. And the school subject social studies is a mix or a combination of several traditions within academia, such as history, human geography, political science, and sociology. So it's a wide school subject, and it is taught on all levels in the educational system of Norway, but most extensively in the compulsory levels, which are in year 1 to 10. All students have to pass through this particular part. And it is in this school subject that they are supposed to learn most about democracy and how they can be participants in the democratic system. Just briefly on some indexing. because as you may know, Norway, as other Nordic countries, as you can see from the index here, score very high on specific indexing of democracy, and especially on then the Economist's Democracy Index from 2024, which is the most recent one. There, Norway actually has a top score, a perfect 10 in 3 of 5 of the index categories. So this is quite astonishing. It also scores very highly on 2 of the other indexes. So what does this mean? Is Norwegian democracy perfect? Do we do everything right? No. We have to take a brief look. What do they measure in this specific index? It's very focused on electoral democracy, to taking part in elections. And the Norwegian elective system is very transparent and open. So yes, we score very highly there. But what does a perfect 10 mean? Does that really mean that Norway has no room for improvement? Are we perfect? That is also a quite difficult score to have in a quantitative measuring of democracies. What we should probably say here is that compared to other countries, the Norwegian democratic system in this specific context is better than most others, but it is not perfect. So it's difficult to get a perfect 10 because there's the indication is that you cannot improve. But of course, there are things to improve also in the Norwegian democratic system. And we're going to return to that during the day. What I would like to say is that how can we explain this? How can Norway be ranked as a #1 democratic state in the world? And it has to do, of course, with the major parts of being an open, transparent, democratic society. We have a free and fair multi-party election. We have a functioning distribution of power. And we have a judicial system that is focused on the protection of civil rights. And very importantly, we have a cross-political agreement to increase accessibility to elections. We want people to vote, as many people as possible. We have no hindrances towards becoming a voter. You do not have to register. You do not have to go to a certain place in action to vote. You could do it almost everywhere. And the election booths are open for several weeks during a national election, not only on election day, but for weeks in advance. So you have a huge opportunity to actually take part. And this makes Norway very, very highly ranked. But I also wanted to point out more deep-seated reasons for this. As we have tried to state now quite briefly, Norway has very deep and long-standing democratic traditions. And this is then tied to our national culture of independence, of being anti-authoritarian, to being trying to break free from stronger neighboring powers. And we see this many instances in also recent Norwegian history, that those that try to oppose power, the centralized power, usually get the public vote. And the best examples of this are the 2 referendums for membership of the European Union. Twice now, the Norwegian population has refused membership of the EU or the European Union. Even if our neighbors, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, have all joined, in 1972 and 1994, the Norwegian population said no twice. Even if the major political parties, trade unions, newspapers, all were in favor, the population still said no. And it's a strong indication of this opposition to power. Excuse me. So, and also an important long-standing part of this, Norway has a well-functioning and expansive welfare state. We have a large and secure middle class, so people are economically safe. It's a high-trust society, as we share with most of all Nordic countries. There's a lot of social cohesion and lack of severe political, cultural, or religious divides. And of course, we have an extensive and elaborate civic education in all levels of education. And we focus a lot of preparing for democratic participation in the school system. So even if this is very positive, of course, Norway is a well-established and well-functioning democratic state. we would like to focus on some challenges that we now face in Norwegian civic education. And these are also challenges that we that are presenting to you today also feel in our everyday work. In the national curricula, the first one, the idea of democracy is quite loosely defined. There is no specific definition of democratic participation, so it's unclear what kind of democracy schools should prepare students for. And we also think that there is a depoliticization of democracy in Norwegian education, where we remove democratic participation from the political sphere. So democracy becomes very many things, and many of them are unpolitical. And the third challenge that we see is a strong individualistic focus and less focus on the collective and the social level. And it's difficult then for many students to connect with society at large and to see themselves as part of something larger than themselves. They're very inward focused. What is good for me, rather than focus on what is good for society. So I am going to come to a conclusion here, and in doing so I would like to point towards some places where you could read more about what I have been very briefly alluding to, and that is a book called the Oxford Handbook of Norwegian Politics. It was very recently published, but there you will find much more information about Norway as a democratic state. And I also wanted to point you towards a report called The Assessment of the State of Norwegian Democracy. It's in Norwegian, but it has an English summary, and also an article called Social Science Education in Norway, a country report published by the journal Social Science Education that gives you more insight into social science education in Norway. So for the rest of the lectures, we are moving towards research results from two research projects. The first of them, it's called Demosit, and I have added the web address here on this slide, and the second project called Alice, that I have also added the web page address to here if you would like to learn more about them. Thank you.